So, good day everyone. My name is Justine Marie Sarabia Baroy, and this time I am going to discuss the subtopic under reliability, which is entitled Using and Interpreting a Coefficient Reliability. So, for this part, Angela Nicole Arabies and I divided in this subtopic into two. So I will be discussing the first two parts of this subtopic. So I will be discussing the purpose of the reliability coefficient and the nature of the test. So for this part, we are going to use terms which are already discussed by the previous reporters. So, I hope that you have already watched their videos for you to have a deeper understanding of the of this part that I'm going to discuss, and of course Angela as well later. So, without further ado, let us start the discussion. So the topic outline for this discussion is first, we are going to define reliability coefficients, and then we are going to discuss also the purpose of reliability coefficients, and of course the nature of the test. So in the part called the nature of the test, I'm going to discuss like um four types of four different natures of test, and the last one will be discussed by Angela later. So, the intended learning outcomes. At the end of the discussion, the students are expected to be able to first define reliability coefficients. Second is to understand the purpose of reliability coefficients. And lastly, know the importance of the different nature of tests. So these are our intended learning outcomes, and I hope that we will be able to reach these ILOs after discussing this part of the topic. So the meaning of reliability coefficient is already discussed in the first part of this chapter. So now we are just we'll be reviewing that definition, because I know that you already have an understanding of this reliability coefficient. So by definition, reliability coefficient is an index of reliability that indicates the ratio between the true score variance on a test and the total variance. So reliability coefficient is somewhat a numerical representation of a test's reliability. So it raises the question how high should, or like the question how high should the coefficient of reliability be, um, can be associated with reliability coefficient. So the answer for that question will be it depends on the test. So we should still consider the type of situation that the test will be used. So we cannot answer um, it directly na parang ay dapat ganito yung yung reliability coefficient ng ng test mo, ng instrument mo, dapat 0.90 talaga siya para sure, ganun. We cannot answer it definitely. So the answer will always be it will depend on the test, on the situation where the test will be used. So the reliability is a mandatory attribute in all tests that we use. However, we should acknowledge the fact that there are tests where we need higher standards of reliability, for example, and there are tests where we need lower reliability levels. So, hindi po pwede na yung reliability coefficient mo ay palaging nasa 9.90. So, hindi yun siya po pwede. It won't work like that in all of the tests na ginatest natin. So for example, if an instrument or yung specific set of test questions will be used in a life and death situation, for example, ginagamit siya sa mga surgeries, sa operations, or parang in those kinds of fields, diba? Then we need a higher reliability coefficient for those instruments kasi nga buhay ng tao ang nakasalalay doon. But those instruments na used naman in a routine basis lang, parang everyday living lang siya, where we can say na parang good reliability should be fine. Yung nasa average lang siya, it should be fine kasi it will still work kahit na hindi siya nasa 0.90 or nasa 90% talaga yung coefficient of reliability ng test instrument na yon. So, reliability coefficients parallels with many grading systems where 0.90 is considered as high, 0.80 is good, and 0.60 to 0.70 is weak. Although, weak siya, ina-consider na yung 0.60 to 0.70 is weak, it is still considered as parang good enough pa din siya. Yung below na ng 0.60, yun yung unacceptable na reliability coefficient. Now, we are in the second part of my discussion, and we will be discussing about the purpose of reliability coefficients kasi nga gusto nating i-interpret and gamitin yung reliability coefficient. So, we need to know its purpose. So, in this part, the same as the first one, there will be terms na na-discuss na before, and I believe the terms that will be used during my discussion is already discussed by Jella and Welrose in the previous report. So in those parts, so you need to understand their discussion before you will understand this discussion. So now we will discuss the purpose of reliability coefficients. So the reliability estimates are used to test specific error variances. So ano yung reliability estimates? Yung reliability estimates, yun yung mga retest, yung parallel and alternate forms, yung na-discuss na sa previous reports. Yung split half, yung inter-item consistency, and the inter-scorer. Yung error variances naman, these are the test construction, test administration, and test scoring interpretation. So, di ba, yun yung reliability estimates at yung error variances. So, the reliability estimates are used to test specific error variances. So, using the reliability estimates, iti-test natin yung error variances ng isang test instrument or para malaman yung reliability ng isang instrument. So, yun. So, there is this question na it says, will the way of how the test is administered affect the score of the individual? So, based on that question, malalaman natin na yung tinutukoy is may association siya sa test administration, which is an error variance. Diba? So, the retest reliability is used to focus on error variances in the test administration. So, for example, factors like noise from the outside or the test environment can interfere with the test taker's attention, thus affecting his overall score. Kasi 'di ba, example, nag-take ka ng test and yung test na yun is for ano siya, for testing siya, or nag-take ka ng ng test, tapos mayroong isang scale na tinitest, tapos ikaw yung participant na tinitest yung reliability coefficient, tinitest yung reliability ng instrument na yon. And if you are the individual, if you are the participant, 'di ba, yung noise from the outside, which is considered as an error variance under test environment, 'di ba, sa test administration siya na error variance, it can interfere with your attention and it will affect your overall score. Kasi kung napakaingay sa labas, of course, hindi ka makaka-focus. So, it will affect your overall score. Or it will have an effect on the score of the individual, regardless kung ano man yung factor na naka-interfere sa kanya. Ganon. So, for example, the yielded scores are the same after taking the test twice. Kasi diba sa test, retest, reliability, mayroong initial test, tapos after a span of time, another test will be given to you, the same test will be given to you. Yung parang retest niya, kaya nga tinawag siya na test, retest, reliability. Kasi ito test if yung answers mo ba are the same, ganon. So, under yun siya sa test, retest, reliability. Na test, retest, reliability estimate. Ganon. So, if the yielded scores are the same after taking the test twice, and let us assume na the measured construct is, for example, a stable trait. Ganon. Isang trait, for example, extroversion. Ganon yung trait na gina-measure. So, then, the only error variance that is eliminated is the test administration and not on test construction, etc. because the test construction is not involved in computing the reliability coefficient of the test, retest reliability. So, ganun siya. Na, for example, if after mo nag-take ng test na yon, yung scores mo nakuha mo na after mo nag-take na initial test and ng retest, tapos yung nakuha na yung score mo, ang only error variance na eliminate natin is yung test administration na error variance. Hindi test construction, kasi yung test administration, nakafocus siya doon sa pag-administer talaga, yung the way how the test is administered. Ano yung mga factors na naka-affect sa'yo nung nag-take ka ng test. Hindi siya nakafocus sa, for example, other error variances like test construction, etc. Hindi siya nakafocus doon kasi hindi ka naman di ba yung test construction is yung error variance na sa test mismo, yung construction of questions, yung ganon. So, hindi ka naman interfere with test construction. So, yung ma-eliminate na error variance is only the test administration, because the other error variances are not involved naman in computing the reliability coefficient of the test, retest, reliability reliability estimate. So, the test, retest, reliability examines if an instrument is stable across any other context or type. So, the stability of the instrument in any other context or type, yun yung ina-examine ng test, retest, reliability. Thus, an individual reliability coefficient may provide an index of error from test construction, test administration, or test scoring and interpretation. Every reliability coefficient can provide an index of error from the different error variances. So, yun. Various reliability coefficients do not show the same source of error variances So every time we interpret reliability coefficients, we need to look at certain aspects that the reliability estimate focuses on. So not all the time na yung reliability coefficients ay lahat ng parang sources of error variance ang pinapakita niya. So, hindi lahat ng reliability estimates parang gina-target niya yung error variances, lahat ng error variances, hindi. So, there are reliability estimates na focusing only on error variance, only one error variance. Meron din na more than one error variance yung gina-test niya or yung target niya kumbaga na ma-examine. Ganon. So, we have this table which shows the summary of reliability estimates, their purposes, other sources of error, variances, etc. So, andito siya indicate siya. And I hope if we will be discussing this on face-to-face, sana no maklaro siya hanggang sa likod, we will try to i-change na lang natin if ever na hindi talaga siya makita sa likod. So, this is table 5 for the summary of reliability types. So, andito na makita siya parang the same lang din siya nung explanation ko kanina. So, we have the types of reliability, yung test retest, alternate forms, yung internal consistency, and interscorer. So, we have their purposes. So, yun ang test retest. Diba sabi ko, ang gina-evaluate niya is the stability of a measure. Then, its typical use is when assessing the stability of various personality traits. So, the number of testing sessions, kasi nga, test, retest siya. Kailangan mo ng initial test and then one for the retest. So, dalawa yung testing sessions niya. Yung sources of error variance is on the administration. Kasi nga, yun yung gina-examine niya or yun yung target niya na ma-test yung sa test administration. Yun, ang statistical procedure na ginagamit or procedures, pwede siyang gamitan ng Pearson R or ng Spearman-Rao. Ang next is the alternate forms. So, the alternate forms, its purpose is to evaluate the relationship between different forms of a measure. And then, the typical use is when there is a need for different forms of a test. For example, yung sa makeup tests. The number of testing sessions can be 1 or 2. And the sources of error variance on which the reliability is focused on is the test construction or administration. And the same as the first one, sa test retest, yung statistical procedures na pwedeng gamitin ay Pearson R or Spearman-Rao. So, the alternate forms reliability is one of the parang robust type of reliability estimate to use kasi nga parang hitting two birds in one stone siya kasi it can evaluate or it can test two error variances at the same time kasi nga sabi ko 'di ba hindi lahat is kayang mag-evaluate or mag-test ng dalawang error variances. So yung iba isa-isa lang talaga pero siya yung alternate forms it can be used to evaluate test construction. Yung parang target niya talaga is test construction and administration. So, even though the alternate forms is a robust type of reliability, the method is very taxing din. So, mahirap siya kasi madami kang dapat gawin. So, yon. Next is internal consistency. So, yung sa internal consistency naman, yung target niya na error variance is sa test construction. Kasi nga, internal consistency, dapat consistent siya. So, dapat yung questions mo na for example, your test has a 10 items. So, 10 item test siya. Dapat yung questions mo doon, related siya to each other. Kumbaga, parang correlated siya. Mataas yung correlation nila. Kasi yung target ng internal consistency or yung inter-item consistency is the test construction. Yun yung gusto niyang i-test. Yun yung dapat niya i-test. So, ang purpose ng internal consistency is to evaluate the extent to which items on a scale relate to one another. So, yun na nga. So, yung use niya is to when evaluating the homogeneity of a measure. So, if all items ba ay related ba siya to each other? Or iisa lang ba yung construct nila, ganon. So, more of homogeneity later. I will discuss it pa naman. So, lastly, sa inter-scorer reliability, yung focus niya is on the scoring and interpretation. So, kasi nga, inter-scorer, reliability siya. So, ang focus niya is on scoring and interpretation. The purpose is to evaluate the level of agreement between raters on a measure. So, dapat may agreement between the raters on a specific instrument, on a specific measure na ginatest. So, yung use niya or uses niya is for interviews or coding of behavior. So, used when researchers need to show that there is a consensus in the way that different raters view a particular behavior pattern and hence no observer bias. So, yun yung use ng inter-scorer reliability. So, yun yung sa second part ng report ko. I hope you have understood the purpose of reliability coefficient. So the last part that I'm going to discuss is about the nature of the test. So yun. In measuring the reliability, one must consider the nature of the test aside from considering the sources of errors from the different sources of error variance. So, yung purpose ng reliability coefficients, 'di ba? Na-discuss natin kanina yung the different sources of error variance and kung ano yung mga kung ano yung mga reliabilities na naka-focus sa different error variances. So, to measure reliability, kasi gusto nating malaman kung paano i-interpret at paano gamitin ang reliability coefficient. So, in measuring reliability, hindi lang dapat yung sources of errors from the different error variances, yung na kung hindi lang doon dapat tayo nakafocus. Kumbaga, dapat i-consider din natin yung nature ng test. For example, this example can be found in the book. Then, so, for example, a number of psychological tests have been developed for use with infants to help identify children who are developing slowly or who may profit from early intervention of some sort. So, measuring the internal consistency, reliability, or the inter-scorer reliability of such tests is accomplished in much the same way as it is with other tests. So, however, kasi if you are identifying yung children who are, yun nga, slowly or developing slowly, or yung who needs to be yung parang who needs intervention of some sort, yung ganon, you can use internal consistency reliability, yung inter-score reliability. Pwede din yun. So, it can be used to measure the test, yung test na gina-develop mo for the children. However, if we will use the test-retest reliability, there will be a problem. Kasi, we all know that children develop their abilities, like they grow in a rapid and uneven manner. Parang may growth spurts, 'di ba? Yung lalo na pag bata pa. So those growth spurts will, of course, it will affect the it will affect test retest talaga in a different way. Kasi yung for example, yung internal consistency, reliability, yung test questions mo naman yung tinitingnan niya. Diba? Kung correlated ba yung questions ng test na ginawa mo na gusto mong i-administer. Pero sa test-retest reliability, hindi pwede kasi, for example, magbigay ka ng test ngayon, tapos after specific span of time, for example, years, after 3 years, for example, ibibigay mo ulit yung test na yon doon sa subjects mo, doon sa participants mo, there will be change. No, there is a possibility that the participant or participants will perform very differently in two testings. So, mahihirapan ka. Hindi naman pwede na ibigay mo sa iba yung test na yon kasi hindi na yung test-retest, test and test na yun kasi different na yung subjects mo. So, dapat the same subjects and yun na nga, may possibility na different yung performance nung subjects mo in those two testings. So, there will be a marked change in test scores that might be attributed to error when in reality, it just reflects yung genuine change in the test taker's skills. So, kahit na change lang yun sa skills niya kasi nga, for example, nag-mature na siya, yung child na yun, na subject mo, it can be attributed yung change na yun, it can be attributed to error. Kahit na nag-change lang talaga yung test taker skills. So, ganun. So, hindi siya pwedeng gamitin yung retest reliability in some psychological tests na gusto nating i-assess or yun nga, i-test yung reliability. So, kanina, you have heard of homogeneity and dito natin siya i-discuss. So first, homogeneity versus heterogeneity of test items. So homogeneous tests will result to higher inter-item consistency as all items are functionally uniform all throughout the test. So example, yung test mo will be using a scale. So for example, yung life satisfaction scale, yun yung test mo, yun yung instrument mo na gusto mong i-test. So uniform dapat yung kasi uniform kasi nga life satisfaction lang naman. Anong gina-measure ng life satisfaction? Of course, yung life satisfaction lang, yun lang. So uniform siya. Homogeneous yung test kasi yung tawag dyan, construct is, siya, iisa lang. Kumbaga, consistent siya. So, it will result to higher inter-item consistency. If the reliability to be used is yung inter-item consistency, mataas talaga yung inter-item consistency niya kasi nga, iisa lang naman, pang iisang idea lang siya, iisang construct lang siya, life satisfaction, ganun lang siya. On the other hand, heterogeneous tests will yield lower in inter-item consistency. Kasi nga, heterogeneous test siya. For example, yung mga multifactorial tests, yung scale ng motivation. For example, di ba there is a scale for motivation na parang nagamit din ito last semester natin. Yung ginatest niya yung motivation na parang intrinsic, extrinsic, motivation, yung mga ganun yung ganun na motivation skills, yung AMS na motivation, AMS 28 na motivation skill. 'Di ba madami siyang constructs, hindi lang siya na motivation lang yung isa, yung extrinsic, intrinsic, motivation, yung ganun. Ng isang individual, yun yung tinitest. So, there is there is a possibility na it will yield lower scores or lower inter-item consistency kasi hindi siya nakafocus sa isang construct lang. So, unlike the life satisfaction scale nga na sinabi ko, na all items are related to one another, thus resulting to higher correlation with the items of the test. So, mas correlated siya yung sa homogeneous tests kaysa sa heterogeneous tests rather. So, yon. Second is the dynamic versus static characteristics. So, as defined, ang static characteristics are those that are relatively unchanging, like personality traits. The best estimate of reliability would be obtained from a measure of internal consistency. So, yon, internal consistency pa din, yung pwedeng, yung pinaka dapat gamitin or yung best measure to use when we test static characteristics. Kasi yun yung traits na hindi siya nag-change, unchanging siya. Unlike sa dynamic characteristics, which are defined to be those that are constantly changing as a function of situational and cognitive experiences. For example, our mood, emotions, and state. And in this instance, obtained measurement would not be expected to vary significantly as a function of time, and either the test, retest, or the alternate forms method would be appropriate. Kasi there is a difference between state and trait. Kasi yung trait, stable siya. For example, extroversion, introversion, ganon, ng isang tao. Trait, yun siya. Stable yun, hindi yun nag-change. However, yung state, it can change over a period of time. For example, happiness, 'di ba? If happiness scale ang ite-test mo, which is yung construct niya is a dynamic characteristic, hindi mo pwedeng gamitin yung test retest kasi nga pwede siyang mag-change. Na for example, ngayon, halimbawa, ite-test mo yung happiness scale sa isang individual. So, what if, di ba may possibility na during the time na tinake niya yung happiness scale na yun or nag-test siya, is masaya siya kasi for example, nag-girlfriend siya that time. So, mataas yung score na makukuha niya sa happiness scale na yon. Pero after 3 months, tapos, nag-retest siya and yun yung happiness scale pa rin yung binigay mo, of course. Tapos, hindi siya ganun kasaya kasi na-heartbroken siya ng after 3 months. So, syempre, there will be a varying, it will vary significantly. So, hindi mo pwedeng gamitin yung test retest sa dynamic characteristics kasi nagbabago yung state, kumbaga yung emotion or yung mood ng tao. So, the next one will be restriction or inflation of range. If the variance of either variable in a correlational analysis is restricted by the sampling procedure used, then the resulting correlation coefficient tends to be lower. So, lower sample size means lower correlation coefficient. So, if the variance of either variable in a correlational analysis is inflated naman by the sampling procedure, then the resulting correlation coefficient tends to be higher. Higher sample size means lower correlation coefficient tends to be higher. So the same goes for the number of items in a test or instrument. There will be a higher correlation with tests that have more numbers than those who have less for inter-item consistency. So, if yung variance daw ng isang variable in a correlational analysis, kasi gano'n naman, 'di ba? If restricted yung variance by the sampling procedure, of course, yung resulting correlation coefficient will be lower. If inflated naman yung variable, then yung resulting correlation coefficient is higher. The same goes sa sa tests. If the number of items in an instrument in a test will be lower, so if there is a little number of of items in a test, then the correlation with those the correlation in that test will be lower din kasi nga maliit lang yung number of items. So if gusto mo na mataas yung correlation, or if you want your test, the reliability of your test to be higher in the inter-item consistency, syempre dagdagan mo yung numbers, damihan mo yung numbers ng test mo para tumaas yung correlation niya, kasi the higher the number of items, the higher the correlation. Diba? Kaya nga siya tinawag na correlation. So, that is the restriction or inflation of range. The next one, and this is the very last part, this is the very last subtopic that I'm going to discuss. It is about speed tests versus power tests. So, when a time limit is long enough to allow test takers to attempt all items, and if some items are so difficult that no test taker is able to obtain a perfect score, then the test is a power test. By contrast, a speed test generally contains items of uniform level of difficulty, which is typically uniformly low, so that when given generous time limits, all test takers should be able to complete the test items correctly. So score differences on a test or on a speed test is therefore based on performance speed because items attempted tend to be corrected. So sa speed test versus power test naman, if yung characteristic ng power test is although limited siya, but longer yung time limit na binibigay sa subjects, and para ma-attempt nila na ma-answer ang lahat ng items. Pero ang main feature niya or ang main difference niya sa speed test is yung items niya, there are varying difficulties sa items niya. So there are items na grabe kahirap na parang hindi na siya kayang answer ng test taker, or parang walang mapi-perfect na score. So that is the characteristic of a power test. In contrast, yun nga, yung speed test, ang difference niya sa power test is that uniform yung level of difficulty ng kanyang items, and yung time limit niya is generous, but the time limit is shorter than the power test. Kasi, mabilisan siya. Dapat mabilisan yung speed test. Tulad nung speed test na dapat mong i-cross out yung things, yung objects na nakikita mo na the same, parang i-cross out mo siya. So, speed test yun siya. There is a speed test na ganon. So, siya dapat, pang mabilisan. So, the score differences on a speed test is therefore based on performance speed. Yun nga, kasi yung items attempted tend to be correct. So, mas pang mabilisan siya, tapos yung level of difficulty niya is uniformly low lang siya kesa sa power tests. We can say na yung reliability coefficient is not applicable sa speed test kasi nga pare-pareha lang siya. Yung level of difficulty ng items or ng questions in a test is pareha lang siya, tapos uniformly low, kumbaga. So, hindi siya katulad ng power test na kung saan there are varying levels of difficulty sa test items. So, makikita talaga natin yung reliability coefficient. For example, sabihin natin there's this person na nag-take ng test. And if matitest yung cognitive ability niya kasi, for example, yung taong yon kumuha siya ng test, sa test, retest, reliability, for example. Sa first take niya, nakuha niya yung answer sa item na to. It is expected na in the next, or if nakuha niya pa din yung item na yon, yung tamang sagot sa item na yon in the next try or sa retest niya, then mapuprove na yung cognitive ability niya is mataas talaga siya, ganon. So, mas reliable siya, mas mapoportray or mas matitest talaga yung reliability ng test instrument na ginamit, unlike sa speed test. Ganon. So this ends my part of the discussion. I hope that you have learned something from the ideas and the topics that I have discussed. And the next reporter will continue, Miss Nicole Angela Arabis will continue on the discussion. And I hope that you have really learned something about the interpretation and usage of the coefficient of reliability. I hope that you have learnings during my discussion. And if ever you have questions, do not hesitate to ask me directly in any way that you want. And I hope that I can, or I will be able to answer your questions correctly para may matutunan din kayo. Thank you so much. Again, this is Justine Marie Sarabia Baroy, and thank you so much. Have a good day.